Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, where we explore all aspects of ending relationships, separation, and parenting apart. If your marriage or partnership has ended, or you have friends and family who are separating, this podcast is for you. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor, divorce specialist, and co-founder of Amicable, the online legal service for separating couples. In each episode, we look at relationships and separation from different angles, including the emotional, legal, and social. I'm joined by experts and special guests who share their own unique stories, experience, and tips with the goal of helping people end relationships in a kinder and better way. In this episode of the podcast, I was joined by Professor Richard Susskind, OBE, KC. Richard is the world's most cited author on the future of legal services. He is president of the Society for Computers and Law, and he served as technology advisor to the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales. His main area of expertise is the future of professional services, and in particular, the way that AI and other technologies are changing the work of lawyers. He advises leading professional firms, in-house legal departments and governments and judiciaries around the world. Richard has written 10 books, including The Future of Law and Tomorrow's Lawyers. He's also contributed more than 150 columns to The Times. In 2000, he was made an OBE, and in 2022, the King approved Richard's appointment as an Honorary King's Counsel. This episode is focused on technology, the future of family law and legal services. Richard explains how the landscape has changed and what we as consumers can expect for the future, including AI, alternative dispute resolution delivered remotely, and things that haven't even been imagined yet. If you loved this episode, then please subscribe and rate us on your preferred listening platform. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much, Kate. It's really good of you to invite me onto your podcast.
Well, I'm looking forward to having a good old talk, Richard, about technology and how technology can impact when people get divorced or when they separate. And I know that your normal audience are really the professionals who run legal services and governments and policymakers. And you spent decades persuading them that they've really got to embrace technology or risk becoming irrelevant and redundant. And the podcast audience are the people who stand to benefit from legal services really embracing this technology. So let's start by asking you, what do you say to them about how your quest has gone to date? Have you persuaded the legal profession to modernise and update and effectively give better service?
Well, I think you're right to say that my focus, certainly in my writing and I suppose in my advisory work, has been on the profession. But my real interest has always been in the way in which we can use technology to enable people to understand and enforce their entitlements more easily, at lower cost and more conveniently. And so, although the focal point of my public arguments has really been a rallying call to encourage lawyers to embrace technology, I've always had the recipients in mind. And I think that comes through in the book I wrote with my son, The Future of the Professions, where we looked at the impact of AI and other technology in the professions. And an interesting response from many readers was what a pessimistic book it was. And they were referring, allegedly, to the pessimism from the point of view of the provider, because we were challenging the way that traditional professionals work and saying there might be different ways of delivering access to complex ideas and expertise and guidance. And we always said what we think is more important is the recipients of service rather than the providers of service. It's not the purpose of the law to keep lawyers in a living any more than it's the purpose of ill health to keep doctors in a living. So that I wanted to say by way of background, although my publications have been directed at the profession, my real passion and interest is in the recipients of legal service. And I've been doing this for over 40 years. And also, just to throw in, because you yourself, and I suspect listeners too, will not know that my original project at AI and Law was on divorce law. That was as we called it then, the domain of application. I was trying to develop an expert problem solver, an AI system that could essentially help people navigate through the complexities of the Divorce Scotland Act 1976 and related case law. So I'm not entirely an intruder on this particular podcast. But let me answer your question. That was a little bit of a politician's answer, in a sense, answering the question I wish you'd asked in the first place, but that was by way of context. Let me answer the question. I think I've been at it for over 40 years, and I think it's been a slow build up. But we've seen, for example, I think over the last 10 years, far more progress than the previous 30. And in my estimation, the coming decade itself is going to be transformational and revolutionary. I've made a couple of predictions. It's foolhardy to do this, frankly. But in 1996, I wrote a book called The Future of Law, where I made a 20-year prediction. And at the heart of that was the idea that legal content, legal advice, legal documents, legal materials would be directly available to people who weren't lawyers. And that was a 20-year prediction. And to be honest, I think I was probably 10 years out. Another 20-year prediction was made in 2012, I think it was, when I wrote the first edition of my book, Tomorrow's Lawyers, where I said, and I stick by this, that we'd see more change in the coming 2 decades than we'd seen in the previous 2 centuries. All of which adds up to this. I think we're going to see towards the end of this decade and into the 30s fundamentally different ways of helping people who need legal insight and legal guidance, fundamentally different ways of resolving disputes. And so, yes, it's been a long run up, as it were, but I can see the end goal far more clearly now than even just 3 or 4 years ago because of recent advances in technology, which we can discuss.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's been a very slow kind of movement towards this, but now the pace of change is such that it's impossible to ignore it. And I think the key thing, as you said, is that there is so much technology that we can now do to do some of the very basic tasks that it means we have to look at completely different ways. We can't just say we're going to do the same old with a little bit of technology helping us to do what we've always done. We're actually at now that tipping point where we're saying, actually, we have to do things in a completely different way. And I think that's the point you're making, isn't it? We've gone so far with allowing technology to make us more efficient at the status quo, but now we've got to change the status quo. Am I right? Have I summarized that right?
Yes, I distinguish between automation and innovation. And I use these terms in quite precise ways. Automation is what most people think of when they think of technology. They think of taking some kind of inefficient task or process and computerizing it, systematizing it, streamlining it, but not fundamentally changing it, grafting technology onto our existing ways of working. And the first 65 years or so of technology and law has been devoted to automation. But as I've looked at other sectors and other industries and looked at game changing applications of technology, they're very rarely applications or instances of automation. They're far more often examples of what I call innovation. And in this precise sense, I mean the use of technology to allow us to do things that previously weren't possible. That's what I find really exciting, that a lot of what we're doing now and will do into the end of this decade and beyond is using, for example, the web as a platform, which was simply not available in the last century, and now using AI tools, which are now emerging quite rapidly. And I suspect in AMIC, for example, and congratulations on the work you do there, but that would not have been possible without some enabling technologies. So the real excitement here for me is to wonder whether or not particular categories of dispute and particular categories of people who are suffering so badly in one way or another might find it more convenient, they might find it less burdensome, they might find it more affordable to conduct their disputes and to understand the law in entirely different ways, rather than simply saying the answer here is to give more technology to lawyers.
So, what would be an example of an entirely different way then? Because if I think about the work that Amicable have done, we've taken the idea of having two sides out of the equation. So that's one of the things that we thought was fairly fundamental, rather than everybody going to two sides, getting separate advice, and then trying to come to a sort of mediated agreement in the middle. We said, well, if you look at the problem from an emotional perspective, and if you use people's ideas of what their interests rather than their entitlements, and you look at what's in the best interests of families, and you look at a family interest as a whole rather than as two separate things that you're bringing together, that allows you to come up with very different creative solutions. But what are you specifically talking about in the use of technology that would somehow reshape that way of dealing with things when you have to split one home into two, or you have to share a pension, or you have to decide ultimately what a fair division of assets would look like?
Well, let me give you two examples, one perhaps more mundane than the other. The first illustration is relating to the ability for people who are not lawyers and cannot afford traditional legal guidance to be able to go online and understand for themselves what their legal position is, their entitlements, their responsibilities, the options available to them. I find it's not just in law, but in the professions more generally, that it's very disempowering not to know the knowledge or not of a grasp of the expertise that applies to your particular circumstances. And historically, this is what our book in the professions is about, we've had to go to human beings. Now, I'm not for a second trying to eliminate human beings from all interaction, but wouldn't it be wonderful if you could just interact with a system, a reliable system, and you could chat informally in an unforbidding way, and you could explore ideas, conscious that this isn't going to cost you lots of money, and that you can equip yourself and you can feel confident that you at least have some knowledge that applies to your circumstances. Now, this in principle was possible, say, 35 years ago when I did my original work on AI, where we developed essentially decision trees that allowed people to navigate around complex areas of law. But this was very much first generation stuff. What we've seen over the past 18 months or so is the emergence, and we can talk about this in greater detail, but the emergence of a new category of AI system called generative AI system. And one of the key features here, and ChatGPT is a very good example, is that you can communicate with these systems in a way that's pretty much like communicating with another human being. They mimic human conversation. When I use the system, I find myself saying please and thank you. I find myself wanting to apologize for asking the same daft question again and again. But we have, and this is just a remarkable breakthrough, we have developed technologies that allow us to, forgive the term, but interface with, interact with our systems in a way that is intuitive, that doesn't require any particular computer language skills, or indeed any particular linguistic skills, just the ability to chat. And we are also, under the same heading, gathering together more and more materials, which means that when one asks legal questions, and it doesn't simply need to be legal question, when asking any kind of questions, the advice, the guidance, the responses will increasingly be accurate. They're not, just now, they are not fully accurate. My estimation is that within 5 years, we'll have systems that are good enough and certainly way better than the nothing that most people have available to them. So that's the first example. I think we're seeing breakthroughs in technologies which will allow people for themselves to interact with systems as though they were chatting with a human expert. And I think that's a breakthrough. The second is perhaps more challenging and relates to one of my books, which is called Online Courts and the Future of Justice. And one of my preoccupations for some time has been the following question: is court a service or a place? Do we really need physically to gather together to resolve all our differences? Or might, in a digital society, there be different ways of interacting with judges and courts and so forth? And in that book, I explore a whole variety of different methods of what we sometimes call online dispute resolution. But it seems to me that, again, over the next few years, what we will see emerge is not so much, or not only, this kind of technology being used to improve our current court systems, but more in the spirit of amicable, the idea of having a form of ADR, what lawyers call ADR, alternative dispute resolution, delivered electronically. So different ways of resolving disputes that will be mediated through technology. And this could be anything from the equivalent of, again, what lawyers call some kind of early neutral evaluation, where people will look at a problem, often ask an expert, if this went to the courts, how would this particular case or issue be decided? This could be done again by AI systems, through to the kinds of systems that actually, and this is controversial, might make determinations. It's not the same as human judgment. It's not the same as an authoritative court decision, but we will see the emergence of systems that will be able to essentially absorb arguments from parties who are in dispute or parties who are trying to come together and offer some kind of optimum path through. Now, again, this just wasn't possible a couple of years ago, but we can see the path forward. And so, what I'm suggesting to you is that our conventional, and I think you've highlighted it or you didn't use the term, our conventional adversarial system need not, in the era of technology, simply be computerized. We can find very different ways of people equipping themselves, understanding their position, understanding, as I said earlier, the options available to them. And we'll see more and more different apps, different systems, different processes, some of them part of the court system, some of them accredited by the court system, some of them independent of the court system, which for people will offer alternative pathways to resolving their problems.
I can imagine that the first of those two examples probably goes down relatively easy. But the second is much more of a challenge, isn't it, to the traditional structures we have in place? And particularly with the judiciary, I can't imagine many judges feeling that they would be comfortable accepting that a chatbot or an AI bot can actually do their job in a more enhanced way at lower cost and in a fair and more consistent way. How do you deal with the pushback? How do you get people on side so that they don't feel it's an attack on the sort of very foundations of what this country is built on and all about? It must be pretty tough.
Well, it is difficult. It's become easier. And certainly, senior judges, many senior judges just now who are talking about digital justice, don't see what I'm saying as a threat to the traditional court system. They're seeing it as complementary to the traditional court system. They're saying there are many cases that it'd be preferable were handled beyond the court system, but they would like these solutions to be robust and reliable and sensible. And they're seeing that emerging technologies now make this possible. But in many ways, I've always been less concerned about keeping the traditional providers happy. And going right back to your original question, what is it that would be preferable for people who are going through the emotionally draining and damaging and upheaval of separating from their loved ones? And it's not been obvious to me that the traditional adversarial court system is the best way to resolve your disputes. So what you were saying, for example, which in some ways echoes what goes on in continental European systems. If you look at notaries, for example, if you and I were selling and buying a house from one another, we actually wouldn't use separate lawyers. We'd actually use the one notary who would do the legal work for both of us. It's just not what we're used to in this legal system. In our legal system, where often moving houses is like a piece of litigation between parties. And what I'm saying is that, and I talk about this a lot in my book on online courts and the future of justice, that I'm not simply wanting to computerize the adversarial system. What I have in mind would be a far less adversarial system, a far more enabling and empowering system where parties would be brought together. And I think the person in the middle would moderate and be more proactive rather than sitting back and listening to warring partners represented by their gladiators. The judges, as I say, and I want to stress this, we have got a very open-minded and progressive body of judges now who are open to new ways of working. But the question that's often asked of me, does this replace judges, I think is the wrong question. I think the state in the future should provide many techniques for resolving disputes and providing the backing of the coercive powers of the state. And one of the main services, the keystone will be for many years yet, will be the human judge. But why can't we offer other services through the state? Why can't we have forms of online dispute resolution? Why can't we have forms of video courts? Why can't we think of AI-based resolution? I think it's not helpful to frame it as a new way of delivering the kind of justice that traditional lawyers and judges would deliver. But my question from a social and a political point of view is whether or not we can imagine and develop systems that won't be perfect, but will be an improvement over what we have today. And when in my book, and I'm not going to detain you with this just now, when we talk about justice, and this is me being, I'm afraid, a little bit of an academic here, I think we have to be cautious. And I identify 7 different senses in which we might be talking about justice when we talk about improving justice. And some people are talking about fairness, and other people are talking about for example, the availability of dispute resolution services or the availability of legal service, I think is a manifest injustice that many people can't afford law and lawyers other than in extreme circumstances. That the availability has to be balanced against the systems and the processes we use. So one of my challenges is we have a Rolls-Royce system that is affordable for a very few and everyone else is left to walk. So can't we find to push the metaphor a little further, can't we find a different vehicle? And that's been my preoccupation.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because, we often couch some of this stuff in dispute resolution terms. But for a lot of people, particularly with, say, divorce or conveyancing or whatever, there is no dispute. They are asking for somebody to sign off into a legally binding agreement, something that hasn't been a source of dispute, but they have come to an agreement about. So I think in those cases, it's absolutely eye-wateringly obvious that we need a different approach, because pushing that group of people through an adversarial process just because that is the process has been a problem for a number of years. And certainly, obviously, the role that we play as amicable, we are often found by people who aren't in dispute but simply want the legal process ticked. And so you can see that we can be a very easy opening point and start point for some of this kind of process to change, because we are already dealing with people who don't see things in dispute terms. So you're right. Simply looking at how we can deliver an adversarial system to people using technology isn't the answer. This is about changing the way we access justice and our fundamental understanding of what justice means and what sort of services as citizens we want from our government to make sure that we can put some of these financial decisions to bed and that they can't be picked over again. So I think it's looking at it in quite a different way, isn't it?
I think it is. But even if you decide to stay with the language of disputes, I think we need to widen our horizons. And again, in my books, I talk, for example, about dispute containment and dispute avoidance. So if there is a dispute, one of the problems, and I say this not to criticize the courts or lawyers, but one of the problems, as you will know better than I do, is that once a dispute enters the legal system, as it were, there is a tendency for it to escalate. So I talk a lot about how we can put a lid in disputes, and I call this dispute containment. But there's something even more important than that, which I think feeds into your previous observations, which I call dispute avoidance. I say it's putting a fence at the top of the cliff rather than an ambulance at the bottom, because most people would prefer to avoid a dispute in the first place rather than have it neatly resolved by experts. And in the name of innovation and also in the name of technology over the last couple of decades, what I think we've seen is, and again, to extend the metaphor, is people essentially equipping the ambulance a bit better and getting it to the scene perhaps a little bit quicker, but fundamentally not delivering that fence at the top of the cliff. And I've really never met a human being who's not a lawyer who would prefer a dispute well resolved by a large team of lawyers to having no dispute at all. That's just not the way the non legal mind operates. And I think there's a strong analogy here that I often draw in medicine, where for years, and it's tough, but for years, there's been strong advocacy for preventative medicine. A lot of someone said to me the other day, it's not so much a national health service, but a national illness service. But you take the point there that so often what goes on is addressing problems once they've arisen, and the move towards preventative medicine is to prevent the problems arising in the first place. So I like that approach in law as well. And it does seem to resonate with most people who would prefer to avoid the kind of confrontation of the adversarial system that you and I have been discussing. I keep on nearly calling you affable, by the way. It possibly is good a name for your business. So if you hear me hesitating when I mention the name of your business, it's for that very reason.
Well, it's interesting because the point you made at the beginning about, though, you said there's two different approaches to sort of technology, and that first one being the idea that we're getting more information effectively out to people, and that as we could create legal information that was more widely accessible to people, and it could then allow people effectively to become forearmed before they enter into these situations where they've got to make decisions about how they're going to split property or money or whatever. But I guess the thing with that is if we go down that route, if technology is providing more information for people, it becomes a question of not do people have enough information, but how do they know what information to trust? How can we corral our resources to get good quality information so that it doesn't rely on, how you ask the question in chat GTP or which website you go to, but how do we, with all of this information and all of this opportunity out there, how do we make sure that we get credible information rather than disinformation to people to then be able to enter systems however we want to formulate them that will help them resolve disputes? Because it strikes me that that's the bigger issue right now in terms of where we are with technology.
I think there's something, and I'm not accusing you of this, that I call technological myopia, which is essentially evaluating the long-term potential of a technology in terms of today's limitations. And it is I'm putting it as a challenge to listeners and to yourself that there is little point in thinking that in 2030, the kinds of systems I envisage are just going to be what we have today, only a little bit better. I think by 2030, our lives will be changed by technologies that have not yet been invented. We are moving at a remarkable pace here. And so I don't worry so much about the technical issue of whether or not these systems will be reliable. Some people say that's foolhardy, and I don't understand the technology, but I do understand the technology and I also understand the trajectory. So I'd say and this is why I cautiously say within 5 years, I think these systems will be reliable. I think there's a different issue there, though, and we have to think this one through because, in a sense, it's almost a marketing issue, which is how is it that a non-expert can know, as it were, that they're in a reliable system? Because although some systems may be reliable, some systems certainly won't be. And this, I think, is an interesting challenge for the state, not just in relation to divorce law, but in any area of law. How is it that the online systems and services can be regarded with any degree of confidence? Will they need to be accredited by or indeed part of the state? Or might we have the confidence if they're linked to other brands in which we currently have confidence? It might be banks, it might be retail outlets, and so forth. So that's on the one hand, is will the technology work? I'm saying yes, it almost certainly will, but I want to go back to one qualification there. Secondly, how can people be confident, and how can we be confident that they actually are using the systems that are indeed reliable rather than ones that aren't? There is, though, in all of this something that we haven't really thought through in law, which is the kind of assurance, a level of assurance that people will need that these systems have been sufficiently tested and audited and verified and validated and so forth. And I think there's a real contrast here again with medicine. When there's a new medical device or a new drug, we know that there are a whole bundle of fairly rigorous tests using well-established methods like randomized control trials and so forth. And when a drug or a device appears in the market, we know that it has been put through its paces. Unfortunately, we don't have the same methodology yet in law. And also, we don't have, I'm afraid, what I think is vital is a kind of experimental mindset. We're not doing nearly enough piloting. We're not doing nearly enough R&D in this area. We're simply in law not used to the idea of an entirely new way of delivering legal services. Our traditional way is well established. It's been refined and improved over the years. It's probably too expensive for most people, but nonetheless is tried and tested. We have to develop a whole set of techniques to ensure that if you and I develop some kind of advisory service that people are going to rely on, then we can be assured that the processes, the procedures, the controls that have been deployed in developing the system and the outputs of the system have been tested very rigorously indeed. And frankly, we're nowhere in that yet in the legal world. So that's one of the other reasons I think it's going to take 5 years. We are going to have to devote some time to developing these methods.
And so just kind of thinking about it from a consumer perspective, so if someone is getting divorced, what do you think they could realistically expect to see in the next few years that would make a difference to them?
I think, can I make another related point? One of the things about AI is it's going to help us remove the silos. So historically, human experts have not been able to know everything, and so we've divided into disciplines. But you'll know again better than I do that, to use a medical term, most people who come to lawyers, there's some kind of comorbidity going on there. There's more than one problem. And so very often people who come to lawyers and people who are contemplating or in the middle of divorce proceedings, they'll have financial problems as well. They'll have health difficulties too. They might have other interactions with the state that are causing them trouble. They may have employment difficulties and so forth. And what I want to move towards, again, this is the automation innovation point, is not simply the idea of an online AI advisor that can chat to you mimicking the way a lawyer would speak to you today. We can do far better than that. We can offer the facility for people to sit down with a system and chat with it, and that system will be able to roam through a whole bundle of different issues and offer some kind of integrated multidisciplinary perspective. It would be like having a team of leading experts at your disposal at no cost at all, answering your questions in a non patronizing, non forbidding, affordable way. And I think that we're not, by 2030, I expect that that's how it will be. And it'll be very different from today, where we feel alienated, we feel disempowered when we need to rely on others. You'll simply sit down with it might be your laptop, it could be your handheld, it might be a little robot with which we'll be communicating. You say, I'm really worried. I think I'm going to be splitting up. I've just got no idea what this means for me. I don't know what it means for the house. I don't know what it means for the kids. I've just got no idea. And there will be a system that will patiently take people through the various aspects of the very complex and terribly challenging times they face. Now, there's a big issue here. Would people want to do that with a system rather than a human being? And that's something we can discuss.
Well, certainly that's the problem we had when we set up Amicable, because essentially what you're describing is what we offer people is our 3, 15 or 30-minute calls to run through all of it, not just the legal bit of it, but the all of it bit, the emotional bit, the health bit, the whatever bit that they need. And when we started that, we had all of that in an app. People didn't want an app. They wanted to interact with a human. So we came up with this idea that it was the integration of human and technology and how you mix that for different people, and understanding that people wanted that in different dilutions, that was the key to success. So that's how we came up with the idea of it not just being a technological solution, but also looking at how humans integrate with it. And I guess what you're saying is it will be like that, but with a huge amount of different things that we can't possibly provide. So anything that you think of that you need, however bespoke and unique to you, ultimately some kind of AI will be able to handle the totality of it, whereas we're dealing with a slice of it still. It might be a broader slice than typical lawyers do, but it's still a slice. And I guess the other key thing is what we notice is you need to repeat this stuff, and it needs to be repeated consistently and to multiple audiences. So the first time you ask the question, you may be on your own, but you may want your partner or other people involved in this to hear the answer subsequently, and you want the same answer. You don't want them to go off and type in another question and get a different answer, because it's the consistency and everybody understanding what the landscape looks like in order to be able to make these decisions that actually is very important to people from a consumer end user perspective.
On the last point, there's no reason at all why these systems shouldn't embody that kind of good practice as well, and then find different ways of reinforcing and continually nudging and sharing amongst the community of people who are interested. Your earlier observation is all important, that what you're saying is, for some years yet, is going to be a blend of technology and human. And some people would prefer more human than technology, and some people prefer more technology than human. That'll change over time as our systems become increasingly capable. People will think, well, actually, it's always nice chatting to a human being, but it's just amazing how much more this system can do than any human being. And we've also got to fold into this that as we move through time, people are more and more tech savvy, that people are used to
Well,
using
digitally native,
technology.
aren't they? Exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's right. But it's not just, I'm just not having these conversations in law. I'm having it in education. I'm having it in health. I'm having it else in other parts. Everywhere, we're all moving in the same direction. So as it becomes second nature for all of us to interact more and more with systems, and of course, as you say, the digital natives become the main target for help, I think we'll see a shift in mindset. I often say, I advise tax people quite a lot. And it's interesting, the United States, more than 50% of people use some kind of online tax service to submit their tax returns rather than the human tax expert. And I joke afterwards that very few of these people are regretting the loss of social interaction with their tax advisor. And everyone laughs at that, except tax advisors, of course. But what I'm poking fun at there is really the notion that somehow we think the interaction with the human being is the indispensable and vital part of this. Now, as it happens in divorce law more than other areas, of course, having an empathetic advisor, often divorce lawyers say to me, I'm not, in some ways, I'm not really a divorce lawyer, I'm more of a counselor than that. To which I would often say, well, how much training have you had in counseling? Have you taken a 3-year course in this? Uh, Whereas I would suggest to you that
And
the
wow,
AI,
you're expensive for a counsellor. Yeah.
well, I couldn't possibly comment, but the AI system, of course, will be as competent in counseling as it will be in dispensing legal advice. But the question does remain the extent to which people want to share personal private issues with machines. And the evidence suggests actually that some people prefer the anonymity of sharing very private details with machines, and particularly young people.
Well, a lot of what we see as well, there's quite a gender divide on that one as well. A lot more men are comfortable sharing with a computer, and a lot more women prefer to share still with a person to get that interaction. But you're right. I think your point you make is, because my last question was going to be, do we really think machines can express empathy? Well, maybe not right now, but obviously all of this conversation has been, let's not worry about what's going on now, because in the future, the answer to that question will presumably be a resounding yes, and they'll even be better than humans with the whole empathy side of things. Am I right? Is that where you're going with this?
Yes and no. It's very interesting. That one of the very early and dramatic developments in AI was when a man called Joseph Weizenbaum, who was a computer science professor at MIT, developed, I think in the 60s, a system called ELIZA. And ELIZA, essentially, he developed a little bit of a joke to mimic a psychotherapist, a particular type of psychotherapist. And so when you said something, if you mentioned your mother, it would say automatically, how did you get on with your mother and so forth. But it was actually almost as a joke demonstrating how systems could appear to interact in a human way. And what shocked him was once when his secretary asked him to leave the room when she was experimenting with it. And that led him to write an entire book called Computer Power and Human Reason, where he looked ahead and foresaw so many of the ethical issues that are arising with AI today. So there's a long history of the question, can machines in some sense empathize with you? Now, there's two dimensions to empathy. There's the cognitive and the affective side of it. Now, cognitively, can I imagine that a computer system in the future can respond to me in a way that I would find comforting? It would find the right words. It would somehow know what I need to hear, and so forth. I can imagine that entirely. It will have billions of mots justes to draw on for that purpose. Do I think the machine, however, is feeling my pain? Do I think it is actually on the verge of tears because of how distraught I am? I think we're nowhere near that. And of course, it's contentious whether or not machines will ever have spirit and soul and consciousness like we as human beings. But the issue may be that the cognitive side of the empathy might be sufficient. We write about this in our book on the future of the professions. And there's a professor in Coventry who's done some interesting work on this, and he's talked about this idea we should have the equivalent of a Turing test, which is the test whether or not a computer system can be said to be intelligent. We should have the equivalent to, can we say a computer system sufficiently empathetic? Now, I think that's very much as psychology would say, behaviorally. It doesn't behave as if it's empathizing rather than it's actually empathizing. But that might be enough for us. It may well be that we overstate.
Well, it will be enough for some people on some things, won't it? That's the point. It's the whole. I got asked about sick notes and computerized sick notes, and should we be taking sick notes away from GPs on Monday? And for some things, yeah, but there are some people who they are very active visiting the GP, telling the GP, and being in relation with somebody in that moment is part of the healing process. And an automated sick note is never going to do that. And I guess it's the same thing, isn't it? So it will reduce cost for a lot of people because there will be access to that level of empathy. But for some people who need another human being to bear witness to what they're going through, then I think you're right. I don't think a computer without a soul will ever be a replacement for that.
So what we said in our book, In the Future of the Professions, is there's a new category of person called the empathizer, because our point was if a lot of technical knowledge, whether it be medicine or law or finance or elsewhere, could be dispensed by technology, many people, but not all, many would like that knowledge to be shared, imparted, and clarified and discussed with someone who's empathetic, but not necessarily expert. So we envisage there could be a new category of professional person who is expert at working alongside some form of AI systems that are delivering the diagnosis, as it were, but the human empathies are still there for those who need this. But what you've been stressing, and I think is so important throughout this discussion, is one size does not fit all. And I've never suggested that it's simply a question of replacing all human beings with machines and away we go. What I'm saying is we're developing here one of the most powerful set of tools and technologies that some of which I do believe will displace traditional human beings, but many of which will work alongside human beings. And that blend will be, I believe, a higher quality of service and a more affordable and available service too. And that's why I find it so really stimulating. We're living in a time of greater technological advance than humanity has ever witnessed. We've got to turn this around for the benefits of the recipients rather than the providers.
Well, we hear such a lot of negative stuff, don't we, about technology and the way we're going and the way the world is. It's really lovely to have the chance to really think about how it's going to liberalize and improve how we all access justice and what we mean by accessing justice and how we can resolve these very human problems. So, Richard, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining me. Where can people find out more about you?
Oh, I've got a website, susskind.com. I've written quite a few books, as I think you've mentioned. And some of my stuff I do some,
And we'll make sure they're in the show notes as well for everybody to be able to click and look. Yep.
I do some talks online. I give quite a lot of public talks as well. But if you want the more difficult book is The Future of the Professions, which goes into a lot of this in quite a lot of detail, underpinned by quite a lot of research. But I've often found as an author that people like short, cheap books. And so the short, cheap book is Tomorrow's Lawyers, which is an introduction to most of the issues we've been discussing today.
Well, great. Well, as I say, we'll put them in the show notes so people can take their pick in terms of reading and following up. But it's been great talking to you. So thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you, Kate.
If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to subscribe for updates, then please visit thedivorcepodcast.com, or you can find us on your favourite listening platforms. For separation and co-parenting support, please visit amicable.co.uk, where you can explore our free resources or book a free advice consultation. Thank you, everybody, for listening.